What if the scar on her face made the whole world laugh? Until a millionaire walked in and silenced the room with just one sentence. She was a quiet waitress mocked for something she couldn't hide. But what happened next turned humiliation into a global movement. Keep watching. Because by the end, you won't see scars the same way ever again. The diner buzzed with the usual late afternoon chaos. Coffee pots hissing, silverware clinking, the hum of muted conversation rising beneath the flickering neon sign outside that blinked open like a tired heartbeat. Lena moved between tables with practiced grace, her apron stained but clean, her smile tight but real, and the long scar that curved down from her right cheek to the edge of her jaw. Faded, old, angry, barely hidden beneath strands of chestnut hair. She knew it was there. They always noticed. The new customers are always noticed. A table of 4 near the window, dressed in crisp clothes and dripping entitlement, didn't even try to hide their stares. The blonde woman giggled behind her menu, leaned in close to the man across from her, and whispered far too loudly, "Do you think she got that in a knife fight?" The others burst into laughter, sharp and high like broken glass, and Lena kept moving, tray steady in her hands, pretending not to hear. But her ears burned. One of the men pulled out his phone, angled it low, and snapped a picture. She heard the shudder, then the chuckle, smile. "Waitress," he said with a smirk. "Show us your good side." Her jaw tightened. She placed the coffee down without a word. Another woman muttered, "She looks like a villain from one of those horror flicks." The air grew heavy. Other customers turned to look, some curious, some smirking, a few pretending not to notice. Lena felt every gaze like a spotlight. Her heart thudded against her ribs, her hand trembling just enough to spill a bit of hot coffee onto the table. "Watch it," the man snapped, clumsy and creepy looking. Impressive combo. Something twisted inside her, something old and familiar. Shame mixed with fury, the silent scream she'd swallowed 1,000 times. She wanted to speak, to scream, to vanish. But she simply nodded, whispered, "Sorry," and turned away, retreating to the counter where her hands gripped the edge like it might hold her together. Behind her, the laughter continued, unapologetic, cruel. She didn't cry, not yet, but her reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine stared back at her with hollow eyes. And in that moment, she wondered, how much longer could she keep pretending this scar didn't define her? How many more tables would she have to serve before someone looked past it? And outside, parked just beyond the neon light, a dark car idled. Its windows are tinted, engine silent. Someone was watching. The moment Lena walked through the diner doors the next morning, she knew. Something had shifted, something subtle but cruel, like the way air changes right before a storm. And though the tables were full and the coffee was brewing and the register was ringing, all she could feel were the eyes, the stares that slid over her like blades disguised as glances. She kept her head down, tied her apron with shaking hands, and grabbed the order pad, pretending not to notice the way 2 customers at the counter nudged each other and whispered, phones angled in her direction. She had seen it the night before, the viral video. A shaky clip of her humiliation looped with slow motion, zooms and meme captions like, "When the monster takes your order," and "free nightmares with every burger." And the comments beneath had bled something cold into her veins. Thousands of them. Cruel, thoughtless, funny. To everyone but her, she hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. She'd stared at her scar in the bathroom mirror for an hour and wondered if she could ever look the world in the eye again. And now, here she was, back in the same fluorescent-lit battleground, pretending nothing had happened, while her insides trembled like glass on the edge of a shelf. She took orders with a voice she barely recognized, smiling just enough to seem normal, moving through the aisles of clinking plates and bitter coffee with the grace of a ghost. And every so often, a voice would cut through the air. A loud whisper, a stifled laugh, a fake cough followed by Scarface muttered just low enough to sting. She caught her manager staring at her when he thought she wasn't looking, caught her coworker quickly swiping her phone screen away when Lena walked past, caught the reflection of her own face in the napkin dispenser. Scarred harshly beneath the overhead lights, unflinching, unkind. It was when a child asked loudly, "Mommy, why does that lady look broken?" that something inside her cracked, the tray in her hand dipping, the cups rattling, one nearly tipping over before she steadied it with a hand she didn't feel. The mother didn't apologize. No one did. And Lena, swallowing the ache that crawled up her throat like fire, simply said, "It's okay." Though nothing was. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she stayed. Because something deeper than pride rooted her to the floor. Something fierce. Something wounded but still alive. And somewhere near the back of the diner, seated in the shadows, someone else had seen everything. He hadn't laughed. He hadn't spoken, but his eyes never left her. The tray slipped before Lena even realized her grip had loosened, crashing to the floor in an explosion of glass and coffee that splattered across the pristine tile like blood across a battlefield. And the diner fell silent in a way that wasn't just awkward, it was surgical, like the air had been carved out to make room for the humiliation that followed. The silence only lasted a beat before the snickers returned, sharper this time, emboldened by her mistake. "Guess the monster can't carry drinks either," someone muttered, and another voice chimed in, "Maybe the scar affects her balance." Laughter erupted again, the kind that didn't just humiliate, ow, it dehumanized. Lena stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in shallow jerks, her eyes stinging but refusing to spill, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the murmurs around her. She bent down to pick up the shards, her hands trembling as tiny cuts opened along her fingertips, and not a single person moved to help, not one. The clatter of silverware resumed, whispers swirled like smoke, and just as she thought she couldn't take another second, just as her fingers closed around the last jagged piece, a voice, steady, calm, resolute, cut through the noise like thunder through glass. "She's the most beautiful person in this room." Everything stopped again. The diners looked up, confused. The table that had mocked her the loudest turned around, already smirking, ready to pounce. Lena slowly straightened, her eyes scanning for the voice until they landed on the man sitting at the far end of the counter, his face mostly obscured by a hood and a low-hanging baseball cap, his hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. He stood as if summoned by something sacred, and when he stepped into the light, the hood fell back. Gasps rippled across the room. Phones were raised. Forks dropped. The woman who had called Lena a monster turned pale, because the man standing there wasn't just anyone. It was Damien Cross, the tech magnate, the ghost billionaire, the recluse who hadn't been seen in public in years. And now he was here, in this dusty diner, defending her. His eyes never left Lena's as he took one step closer, then another, and in that moment, no one said a word. Not because they couldn't, but because none of them had anything worth saying. And Lena, still holding broken glass in her hands, had never felt more seen. Damien Cross stood there like a fault line that had just split the entire diner in half, his presence bending the air, every patron frozen mid-breath as recognition crashed into their skulls. The man in the hoodie wasn't just anyone, he was him. The elusive billionaire with a story made of tech empires and whispered scandals. The man the media chased for years and never caught. And now, here he was, standing not at a gala or a conference, but in a rust-stained diner beside a waitress with a scar the world had tried to turn into a punchline. Cameras clicked. Phones shook. The mocking table scrambled to lower their eyes. But it was too late. Their cruelty had been witnessed by someone whose name alone could ruin reputations. And yet, Damien didn't even glance at them, didn't spare them a single flicker of attention. His focus was solely on Lena. She stood still, broken glass in her blood-specked hands, heart thrashing, mind spinning, unsure if she was dreaming or hallucinating. Because how could he be real? How could he be here? How could he look at her like she was the only truth in a room full of liars? He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, kneeling down beside her without hesitation, without ceremony, and gently took the glass from her fingers, his touch soft, grounding, steady. "You don't need to clean up after their mess," he said, his voice low enough only for her to hear, and something inside her, the tightly locked vault of shame and fury and loneliness, shuddered, cracked, and let in a breath of something dangerously close to hope. "Why are you here?" she whispered, barely able to find her voice. He looked up at her, eyes calm, deep, unflinching. "Because people like you are the reason I still believe in anything at all." Behind them, no one dared speak. The manager stood pale-faced near the kitchen. The customers at the mocking table had gone silent, unsure if they should stay or crawl out the door. Damien stood, placed a $100 bill on the counter without breaking eye contact with Lena, and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "If she ever gets treated like that in this place again, I'll buy the building and turn it into a parking lot." Gasps followed. Silence reigned. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. And Lena, still kneeling on the floor, wasn't crying because she was broken. She was crying because, for the first time in a long time, someone had reminded her she wasn't. He didn't return the next day, and Lena told herself that was fine, told herself it had been a moment, brief, surreal, nothing more than a spark in the middle of her storm. But still, every time the door chimed, her heart jumped before she crushed it back down with a forced smile and a pen scratched against a notepad. And then, 3 days later, just as the morning sun spilled through the windows and the diner had settled into its usual rhythm of clinking mugs and tired conversations, the bell rang. And he was there, Damien Cross, no hood, no disguise, just a long, dark coat, steady eyes, and a presence that once again pulled all the oxygen from the room. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to lips, but Damien didn't look at anyone except her. He walked past every stunned face and slid into the last booth by the window, the one furthest from the chaos, and waited. Not for a menu, not for attention, but for her. Lena moved toward him slowly, heart hammering, unsure what to say, unsure what this meant, unsure if this was real. "Back for the coffee?" she asked, her voice barely steady. He smiled softly. "Back for you." She flushed, caught off guard. "You caused quite a stir the other day." He nodded. "I tend to do that when I care." She blinked. "You don't even know me." His gaze didn't waver. "I saw enough." That was the first morning. He came again the next day, then the next. Always alone, always quiet, always choosing her section, her presence, her silence. They talked, first in fragments, then in longer breaths. He asked about her favorite books. She asked why he'd vanished from the world. "Because when people see only the outside," he said once, "you forget you have an inside worth protecting." She didn't ask what happened to him, and he didn't ask how she got the scar. But there was understanding between them, thick as gravity. He saw her, not the scar, not the headlines, her. And for the first time in years, Lena started to believe that maybe her reflection wasn't a punishment, but a story waiting to be rewritten, not because a millionaire had walked into her life, but because he never once looked away. It started with a single photo, grainy, poorly lit, snapped through the diner window, but the face beside Damien Cross was unmistakable. Within hours it had gone viral, not because of who he was, but because of who she was, because of the scar that stretched down Lena's face like a question the world suddenly wanted to answer. And soon, her name wasn't just whispered in the diner or muttered by cruel customers. It was plastered across headlines, hashtags, and late-night segments, her face dissected by strangers who didn't care that every comment carved deeper than the one before. They called her Scarface Cinderella, like it was clever, like it was a fairy tale, like the pain she'd carried her entire life was now just part of someone else's entertainment. Reporters flooded the sidewalk. Photographers shouted her name like she owed them something. Influencers speculated whether it was a publicity stunt or a pity romance. And even some of her coworkers looked at her differently now. Some with envy, others with barely disguised disgust. She tried to smile through it. She tried to keep working and tried to be normal. But every time the door opened, she braced for a flashbulb. for laughter, for the sound of someone reducing her to a scar again. Then one night, she cracked. It was after a woman live-streamed herself mocking Lena from the corner booth, saying she must have something magical under all that damage for him to keep coming back, and the video exploded with laughing emojis and flame reactions. And Lena saw it on her break, alone in the storage room, and something in her chest simply gave out. She rushed out the back door into the freezing alley, her breath ragged, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face like she could hide from a world that wouldn't stop staring, wouldn't stop talking, wouldn't let her just be, she whispered to herself, over and over. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for this, until the words blurred with her tears. And then she heard footsteps. She turned. It was Damien. No guards, no coat, no cameras. Just him. Just eyes that saw through everything. I'm sorry, she breathed. I never wanted this attention. I didn't want... He stepped closer. I know. I did this. I brought the world to your doorstep without asking if you were ready. Why, she asked, voice cracking. Why me? His answer was instant. Because you're the bravest person I've ever met. And the world doesn't deserve to keep ignoring people like you. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folder, and handed it to her slowly. Inside were documents, A's official, powerful, the launch of a foundation, her foundation, dedicated to burn victims, trauma survivors, people scarred inside and out. Her name was on every page, not his, hers. He looked at her like she was light, and for the first time in her life, she didn't flinch under the spotlight. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering the diner's tin roof and soaking the empty parking lot in silver reflections. And Lena stood beneath the flickering neon sign, with the folder still pressed to her chest, her hair slick against her skin, her breath visible in the cold as Damien approached. No umbrella, no coat, only purpose in his eyes and rain on his face, as if he'd walked through a storm just to say what the whole world needed to hear. Inside, the last few customers watched through the window, forks frozen mid-bite, phones raised in disbelief, and behind the counter, her coworkers leaned forward, eyes wide, because this wasn't just a conversation. It was a moment. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice shaking but strong, her hands clenching the folder like a shield. You've already done more for me than anyone ever has. But Damien stepped closer, and the rain didn't touch the space between them. No, Lena, I haven't done enough. The world tried to define you with a scar. I want to redefine what the world sees when it looks at people like us. He held out a small silver pin, delicate, simple, a single engraved word, rise. I want you to be the face of the foundation, he said, and gasps rippled behind the glass. Not because you're damaged, but because you're powerful. You survived in a world that tried to break you, Sisur, and you didn't hide. She stared at the pin, then at him, her chest rising with each breath that felt heavier than the last, because she wasn't just being offered a job or a title. She was being handed a torch. I'm not a leader, she whispered. You already are, he answered. You just haven't stood in the light yet. She closed her fingers around the pin, the metal cool against her palm, and for the first time, she didn't think about her scar. She thought about her strength. She nodded, just once. The decision was made, and the diner behind her erupted into murmurs and stunned silence as she stepped forward. Into the rain, into her future, into a world that, for once, was finally ready to listen. The transformation didn't happen overnight. But when it came like dawn breaking through a decade of darkness, and Lena stepped into her new life not as a symbol created by the media, but as a force born from fire. Her scar no longer a secret to hide or a flaw to fix, but a banner of survival that spoke louder than any headline ever could. The foundation launched with a single live stream. Lena in a simple black dress, no makeup to hide the line that traced her face, no filters, no script, just her, raw and steady, her voice trembling only once as she looked into the camera and said, "They used to call me Scarface. They thought that would be the end of my story. But it was just the beginning." The video shattered expectations. Millions watched. Survivors from all corners of the world sent messages, videos, letters. Burn victims, domestic abuse survivors, veterans with missing limbs, teenagers with hidden scars, all saying the same thing. Thank you. Because she hadn't covered it up. Because she hadn't apologized. Because she had stood there and claimed her pain without shame. From there, it only grew. She toured hospitals. She spoke on stages. She sat with people who had stopped looking in mirrors and showed them how to see themselves again. Every time she spoke, she told the truth. Not the polished, scripted version, but the messy, bruised, still healing truth of what it felt like to be mocked in public, to cry alone in bathrooms, to doubt your worth every time someone looked away too quickly. And Damien, he never stood in front of her, never tried to steal the light. He walked beside her, silent when needed, fierce when necessary, always present, holding the space, not owning it. Their bond wasn't a fairy tale. It was forged in pain and sharpened by fire. She didn't need saving. She needed someone who didn't flinch, and he had never once looked away. On magazine covers, they called her the new face of resilience. On talk shows, they begged for the love story angle, but Lena refused to let the world rewrite her again. This isn't about beauty, she said once. It's about truth. And the truth is, I'm not beautiful in spite of my scar. I'm whole because of it. And when she looked into the eyes of a little girl in a hospital bed, clutching her burned teddy bear and whispering, "Will I ever be pretty again?" Lena knelt down, placed the pin that read, "Rise" into the girl's hand, and said, "You already are, because you're still here." And in that moment, the world didn't just watch, it listened. 1 year later, the bell above the diner door rang with the same familiar jingle it always had. But everything that followed was different, because this time, Lena walked in not as the girl people whispered about, not as the waitress with the scar, but as the woman whose story had ignited millions, whose voice had given others their own, whose presence now carried a silence that commanded more than noise ever could. And as she stepped onto the worn tile floor, heads turned. Not in ridicule, not in pity, but in reverence, in disbelief, in recognition that the world had changed and so had she. The scar was still there, as it always would be, but now it didn't walk ahead of her. It walked with her, part of her truth, her armor, her signature, and the way people looked at her now was different. They saw not the wound, but the warrior who had stood in the fire and refused to melt. She wore a simple dress, a silver pin on her collar that read, "Rise," and as she moved toward the booth in the back, the same one Damien had once claimed like a quiet protest against the world, she paused, because something familiar caught her eye. Table 6, the laughter, the voices, the same faces, the ones who had mocked her, recorded her, and turned her pain into their entertainment. They didn't recognize her at first. Power changes the shape of people. But then one by one they looked up, and their expressions shifted from casual to confused to stunned silence as realization swept across their table like a gust of justice. She walked up to them without hesitation, every step smooth, every breath steady. And when she reached their table, she didn't raise her voice or narrow her eyes. She simply stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle in. They opened their mouths, maybe to explain, maybe to apologize, but she held up a hand gently and said, "Don't." Then, reaching into her clutch, she pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it neatly on their table. "Lunch is on me," she said, her tone calm and unshakable. "I figured you might still be hungry." And before they could say another word, she turned, walked away, and left behind not a storm of anger, but the quiet, devastating weight of grace that would echo in their silence for years to come. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled, the lights dimmed to a soft gold that made the stage glow like a sunrise waiting to break, and Lena stood at its center. No teleprompter, no notes, just her in a simple navy suit with her scar fully visible beneath the lights. A scar that once silenced rooms now commanding the world's attention. And as she looked out over the sea of faces, survivors, leaders, students, strangers, she felt no fear, only purpose, only the quiet pulse of truth waiting to be spoken. She took a breath, steady and full, then began. "I used to hide my face," she said, her voice clear, strong, and without apology. "I used to think this scar was the end of something, the mark of what I'd lost, but it wasn't. It was the beginning. It was the doorway to every person I've ever helped, every message I've ever received from someone who said, 'Because of you, I didn't give up.'" A hush fell over the room, not of boredom, but reverence, and she continued, "We live in a world that teaches us to erase the parts of ourselves that make others uncomfortable, to shrink, to cover up what makes us different. But I'm standing here to tell you, your difference is your power, your survival is your strength. And no one gets to define your worth but you." The crowd leaned in. She could feel it, feel them. "I was once a waitress who got laughed at for something I couldn't change. I was recorded, mocked, and turned into a joke. And now I help others rise." Her hand brushed the silver pin at her collar. "Because we are not here to be perfect. Oh, we are here to be real. And real is powerful." She paused. Then, with tears in her eyes and steel in her voice, she finished. "This scar didn't ruin me. It revealed the world around me, and I chose not to mirror its cruelties. I chose to change it." The room erupted, standing ovation, applause that sounded like thunder wrapped in grace. But Lena didn't smile for the cameras. She looked up, through the lights, as if searching for the girl she used to be. The one hiding in the bathroom, crying quietly, believing she'd never be enough. And in that silent second, she whispered to herself, "You were always more than they ever saw." And somewhere in the back row, Damien stood watching, his eyes never leaving her, a quiet smile on his face, not as a savior, but as the man who once saw her in the shadows and chose not to look away. They turned her scar into a spectacle. They stripped her humanity, but she didn't fight back with revenge. So she fought back with grace. And when she stood in front of the world, unashamed and unfiltered, it wasn't their cruelty that echoed, it was her courage. You may forget their faces, but hers, the one they tried to shame, will never leave you.